Hello, I'm Robert Ellis, and this is the second of a planned series of lectures on the Christian Middle Way, which accompanies my book of that name. In the first lecture, I talked about the difference between faith and belief, in the sense that I'm using them, where faith is embodied as part of our experience, but belief is abstracted, particularly absolutized belief is unnecessary and unrelated to our experience. The middle way, I talked about as well, can be based on faith in that sense, rather than absolutized belief. I also talked about God as an archetype, as part of our experience, rather than just an absolutized abstraction. In this second lecture, I'm going to talk about religious experience, particularly. That will also involve talking about concepts from Christianity like revelation and idolatry. So let's think about that term religious experience, which is really similar to other terms that people use like spiritual experience, and I don't think it's completely distinct from mystical experience or indeed artistic experience, profound experience of any kind. There's been some interesting research done on religious experience, particularly indicating that it's far more common than many people realise. So in David Hayes' research, for example, he reported that in private interviews, up to 62% of people said that they had some kind of religious or mystical experience. So it's part of people's lives. It's not a remote thing. That obviously we hear about religious experience in the context of the mystical tradition in Christianity and in the context of great figures in the Bible, for instance. But it's you or me that will have religious experiences. They're part of what it means to be human. And we need to understand it in relation to that common human experience, rather than as something removed and abstract and long ago. So religious experience is very much associated with bodily awareness. People who have religious experiences report an ecstasy filling their bodies. There's access to emotional energy, to what they might take to be divine inspiration, which is energy animating a person. The research in relation to religious experience also tells us something about the relationship of religious experience to the right hemisphere of the brain and the dominance of the right hemisphere as opposed to the left. There's a wonderful TED talk which I'd highly recommend you go on to after you listen to me. If you're on YouTube, go to the TED talk given by Jill Bolt Taylor, which is called My Stroke of Insight, where she gives an account of how her left hemisphere was disabled by a stroke, one instance, and she, being a neuroscientist, was able to observe precisely what was going on and account for it afterwards. But during that stroke, she lost the conceptual, controlling, goal-orientated side of her experience, and she was left with an expansive, open kind of experience, what is often described as mystical experience. If you completely disable the left hemisphere, you'll get that in a particularly pure form, obviously. But there will be degrees of it. There will be degrees to which we are able to temporarily experience a larger perspective of the kind that the right hemisphere gives us, because the right hemisphere is connected to our embodied experience, our sensual experience, our metaphorical understanding and sense of meaning, all of those things, and our connection to others as well. So religious experience can link us to new stimulus from the body, from the world around us, and from the imagination. And all of that can help with wider awareness to give a context to the everyday beliefs that we hold. Another thing that researchers have found from religious experience is de-automatization. That is, the tendency to become more aware and thus less habitual in our thinking and assumptions. Particularly a researcher called Arthur Dykman has found out more about that. There's also a link between religious experience and the temporal lobe, which governs our awareness over time and space, very much suggesting that the right hemisphere gives us a bigger perspective over time, whereas the left hemisphere tends to be temporarily isolated. So we tend to assume, in other words, that what we're experiencing and thinking now is the whole story. We forget that things were actually quite different in the past, and that they might be quite different in the future, and that indeed we might have rather different attitudes to things than the ones we have now. And particularly if we're in a constricted state like depression, everything seems to be overwhelming us at this moment. So religious experience of that kind is highly meaningful, and you can relate that meaning to all the accounts of religious experience that you can read from the Christian tradition and from other traditions. There are a great many sources of those kinds of accounts. You just have to search for them on the web if you want to look at accounts that people have given of their mystical experiences. Those accounts are not limited to a particular kind of person. They're not limited to religious believers at all. They're not really limited to a particular religion. They're obviously an aspect of being human. Now, one of the key points I want to make in the book Christian Middle Way is that these highly meaningful religious experiences provide a big boost to faith, their basis of faith. They do not justify absolute belief. And there's this amazing, completely mistaken convention that's grown up and become entrenched, this idea that we can somehow justify abstract beliefs about, say, God's existence, or about Jesus being the Saviour, simply from such an experience. These experiences are embodied, whole experiences. There's no way that they can justify these abstract, absolutized propositions that people draw from them and then recite in creeds. There's simply no relationship between the two. People have built up those absolutized beliefs, which they express in creedal form, through there's a long process from our basic experience, whereby we build up a sense of meaning through concepts, through conceptual cognitive models, and then through metaphorical extension of those models, so that we end up with metaphors, but the metaphors die, so the metaphors become purely abstracted, sucked out of their live relationship to wider meaning in our experience. So we make these conceptual beliefs entirely out of sort of deadened abstraction, and we've no business doing so, really. There's no reason why we should. The only reason why we do effectively is the social benefits of doing so and the way it suits those in power. So it's very easy to use absolutized beliefs as a way of controlling people and maintaining quite a high degree of obedience within a group and of group conformity. But if we're going to judge things for ourselves, if we're going to develop as individuals, then we need to accept that our experience is our experience. That's all there is to it. It's very meaningful, it's very important, it inspires us. That doesn't mean that you can draw dogmas out of it. such dogmas would be entirely missing the point, really, missing what those experiences can tell us, which is always beyond a specific kind of claim that we can put into language. I mean, perhaps the furthest implication of this kind of traditional approach of appropriating religious experience to the hierarchy of power is found in the tests used by the Roman Catholic Church. So it can only be approved as a genuine religious experience if it fits the teachings of the Church. If it doesn't, then of course you didn't really have that experience, apparently. You can discount it, or you can conclude that it came from Satan rather than God. Well, isn't that convenient? So these experiences have been, well, misinterpreted and manipulated by a great tradition in Christianity, and perhaps by fear contributing to people's wish to attribute them to Satan, for example, if they don't go along with the wishes of the powerful. But religious experiences are not always going to be convenient. They're not always going to fit in. They may indeed lead us in very awkward experiential directions, which might lead us to challenge the existing hierarchy and existing assumptions around us. And a lot of mystics in the Christian traditions, well, have been rather odd figures. They may have had to outwardly conform to what the Church told them to do, but they've also sometimes ended up in conflict with it, or at least being regarded as eccentric. Perhaps Meister Eckhart is a great example of a Christian mystic who did end up in conflict with the Church. And there were others who managed to stay on the right side of it, and some who were obviously in the end greatly supported by it, like St. Francis. But they they had moments on the way where things might have gone differently quite often. So what is it we're experiencing when we have religious experiences? In the previous lecture I talked about the archetypal God. God as an understanding or experience of wider potential. And that archetypal God is, I'm going to suggest, what we experience, or a possible name for what we experience in religious experience. So religious experiences are experiences of God, not as a supernatural entity, but as an archetypal access to a sense of greater potential in our own experience. So at some points we may get access to a sudden intuition of that wider potential. We get a sudden flash of meaning or meaningfulness, whereby we're able to see the world in a slightly different way from how we did before. That may have a permanent effect on us because it opens up another way of seeing, another way of experiencing things and understanding them. But opening up new ways of understanding is not the same as adopting one constricted way of conceptualizing. Indeed, you could say that the experience of God, or what God means in the context of that experience, is infinite, just as God is said to be. It's infinite in the sense that it's open. There's no bounds on it. There's a lack of boundaries, which is what finiteness is about. So we can talk about God as having infinite meaning, and us experiencing that sense of infinite meaning through religious experience. As long as we don't then jump to the conclusion, oh, this proves that there is an infinite being. At that point we're jumping into abstract absolute belief, which we've got no business doing on the basis of that sense of meaning and that openness. So religious experience is not experience of revelation. That is, we've not been given a message from God, as an external projection. Rather, that experience is an experience for us, within us, although still having much implication outside us, so it's not merely individual. Nevertheless, it's part of experience. There are great examples of this kind of religious experience in the Old Testament, where it's very much associated with the emotion of awe. Now, awe seems to combine fear with positive emotion. When we're confronted by something wider, something bigger than what we are now, some sense of new possibilities, that's going to be frightening as well as amazing at the same time. And we combine those two things together and we get awe. You can also talk about the sense of holiness. The sense of holiness is associated not only with enormous positivity, but with danger. So, for example, the Israelites found that Mount Sinai was dangerous to touch. People weren't allowed to go up it because it was holy. If something is holy, then we have to respect it. So respect is a kind of longer-term way of applying that sense of awe. Once the awe itself has fallen away, as all emotions do, we are left with an attitude which can be one of respect towards the holy. Now, that awe is religious experience which can help to inspire us in however we lead our lives. Unfortunately, the tradition the Judeo-Christian tradition contains lots of examples of that awe being exploited particularly by religious leadership. So we have this sense of the God archetype, and we tend to project it onto priests or religious leaders or whatever. We're in a rather open, vulnerable state when we're awestruck. So people who then turn it into absolute beliefs or insist that it implies absolute beliefs are then in a position to require obedience of us to a set of very strict literal laws or other injunctions. So we project that archetype onto powerful leaders. We then become vulnerable to exploitation, and hierarchies then emerge. So the religious experience has been subsumed into the social structure. But at the same time, in that same place in the Old Testament, we can see glimpses in the book of Exodus particularly. We can see glimpses of that kind of religious experience and the recognition of its value and the need to maintain openness to that value. One of those, I think, is the prohibition of idolatry. So I'm going to suggest that although it's often been interpreted in very unhelpful ways, the prohibition of idolatry does contain a very important insight, one that relates closely to the middle way, strangely enough. So what the middle way is to the Buddha, I'm going to suggest the prohibition of idolatry is to Moses, perhaps. So the prohibition of idolatry, what is idolatry? A superficial view of idolatry is the prohibition of images of God. But that's a very literal view of it taken from a specific occasion or the specific interpretation of idolatry that was relevant at the time of Moses. But at the time of Moses, in the context of Moses, remember, most people, a vast majority of people, will be illiterate. So images were by far the most powerful representation of any kind available to the vast majority of people. And writing was a very special thing. So the tablets of stone that inscribe the laws of God are relatively new ways of importing consistency into society, of requiring rigorous reflection on how we act. It was images that offered the disintegrative temptation at that point, rather than words. Today, though, I want to suggest that the opposite is the case. The idolatry of images, well, obviously there were some images that we might become overtly attached to, or addicted to, or have delusions about. But many images, particularly those of the artistic tradition, of many artistic traditions, are much more likely to open us up than anything else. They're going to give new stimulus to our imagination and new ways of thinking about things. So it's a mistake to imagine that art should be prohibited. Representations of people or animals or whatever should be prohibited. If you're doing that, then I think you're leaving behind the helpful interpretation of the spirit of the prohibition of idolatry. It's words that today we tend to take absolutely, particularly when those words are turned into propositions of belief. Those propositions then become kind of magical incantations that solve all our problems for us. They substitute for the actual work of changing anything in a helpful way, or of becoming aware of our states or of the conditions that we need to change. So that understanding of idolatry fits very much with the way that Islam has interpreted it. So in Islam, there is the sin of shirk. So shirk is often defined as confusing God with what is not God. So you might take a sports car, say. You become obsessed with a sports car to such an extent that you're treating it as God. You're treating what is not God as God. You're confusing what is finite with what is infinite, which effectively means you are absolutizing. You are turning something that is not absolute into something that is absolute by means of a shortcut substituting absolute belief. So if we apply that very much to today, rather than taking some sort of decontextualized literal view of it from the past, if we think about how we can helpfully interpret the prohibition of idolatry today, it suggests very much that we should avoid absolutizations. We should avoid beliefs either that positive or negative claims can be absolutely true, which would mean we certainly can't accept creeds, and that points us towards the lack of compatibility between genuine religious experience and the absolutization of that experience. That immediate experience of awe that the Israelites were encountering, in contrast to the attempt to petrify that awe and manipulate it and turn it into something that's subject to the social hierarchy. So that's where the middle way obviously comes in. That the middle way, one way of understanding the middle way, is the avoidance of idolatry, and vice versa, that you can understand the avoidance of idolatry in terms of the middle way. And that means that absolute beliefs are idolatrous, which means that quite a lot of Christianity, as it's turned out, is idolatrous, I'm afraid. So, yeah, whenever people insist on the truth of a particular set of claims in Christianity, claims which are their claims, which they're effectively not taking responsibility for as their interpretation and their claim, that's idolatry. That's taking something which is not God to be God. So overall then, I want to point out the ways here in which religious experience is closely related to faith and the inspiration behind faith as an embodied, meaningful process, and that needs to be contrasted with belief, particularly the form of absolutized belief as it is found in the Christian tradition. So there's this really helpful element in the Judeo-Christian tradition as a whole, and there's this very unhelpful element. And we need to use our critical awareness and our sense of responsibility in order to separate these two things, which is not easy. But it is our responsibility, I think, in the world in which we live now, with the kind of education that many of us have and so on. It's important for us to take the opportunity to use our sense of responsibility to interpret the Christian tradition in a helpful way, not to pass the buck to tradition. Okay, that's all I'm going to say for now. So I've said a little bit about religious experience, particularly in the context of Exodus, and I've talked about Revelation and idolatry. I hope next time to go on to talk about the creation and the Genesis story. Thank you.